It's our end of year episode, and we've got bills that passed, bills that failed, and bills that made us question how anyone comes up with this stuff. Welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number, the podcast where we check out what's happening around the U.S. And this week, a closer look at the legislation that made waves or failed spectacularly this year. I'm Sarah, and with me is Stephen.
Hello, and Happy New Year.
Yes, we are dressed for the occasion today.
Certainly are. We all made an effort here. Got my sort of party suit on. I must say, you're looking very smart.
Oh, thank you. I decided that many necklaces was the equivalent of a lady bow tie. So.
Absolutely. I think it is. So it's been a very busy year in legislation, and obviously we've had some great bills, some bad bills, some strange bills, and in particular, we've looked at some of the sort of the bizarrest bills throughout the year. So what was your favourite bill of the year?
So I think my favorite bill that just really made me think what is going on here was that Oklahoma furries bill that we covered. And that is something that whenever I tell people about the podcast and what we talk about, everybody's like, oh, what do you talk about? And, I'm like, oh, we talk about the stuff that you would assume. But also, we covered this bill about in Oklahoma, yes. They were upset that children were attending school dressed like animals. And I always really deliver the line of, the bill says that if the school calls the parents and the parents can't pick up the kid because they're dressed like a pet, they'll call animal control. And everybody's jaws just drop.
Yeah, I mean, that was a good one. I mean, luckily, the bill didn't succeed. It died in committee. So right. Oklahoma furries are safe from the dog catcher. I think my favourite bill was perhaps one of the ones we got our AI to write about, which was the bill to address the feral chicken problem in Hawaii.
Oh, yes.
So apparently people in Hawaii were being terrorised by chickens. So the legislature felt the need to pass a bill to actually help control them. And that bill did actually become law. If there's anybody listening from Hawaii who is being terrorised by chickens, then you should be safe. Don't worry, your government is on the case. They will protect you from those chickens.
I don't know if you've seen Moana, but in classic Disney fashion, one of the really cute animals in Moana is a chicken. And it's like a super famous actor that voices the clucks. See these videos of him like... it's very funny, and I'm like, oh yeah, chickens are pervasive there in Hawaii.
Yeah, they're everywhere, and they're very loud, which I think was the problem. Another bill, of course, that we covered that was, let's say, a little bit out of the ordinary was the Tennessee Praying for a Solution. So this was a joint resolution that was enacted, so it actually happened last July, that lawmakers in Tennessee decided that the problems facing the state were just too difficult for any earthly solution. So they decided to have a month of prayer and fasting to ask the Almighty for help with actually doing their jobs. Again, if we've got any Tennesseans listening, perhaps you could let us know whether things are all great now in Tennessee, whether the God came through and actually fixed all your problems for you, or maybe not. But another very unusual bill, one that really challenged the division of church and state.
Yeah, I feel like this year was a pretty interesting combination of trends that we're really used to seeing, like immigration, abortion. Those are obviously really hot topics, continue to be here in the U.S. It kind of continues to feel like we can't quite get whatever solution is the solution, right? But then I also feel like this was the year of AI. We talked about AI so much, whether it was deepfakes in elections and being worried about them influencing it, or the nuclear bomb that we talked about with AI. That one, I still to this day, it's just so crazy that we live in a world where we need to have a bill that says that we want AI to not be responsible for launching nuclear weapons.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a great one as well. Gave me an opportunity to talk a lot about war games. So she was actually sort of acting out the plot of war games. Which has now come true. But you're right, AI has been huge this year. So lots and lots of bills around like electric vehicles and sort of controlling them as they wander around our streets. But deepfakes, yes, and the use of AI in elections as well. And obviously, there's been a big year for AI for Build Track 50 as well. We've introduced lots of new AI tools, so it certainly has been the year of AI, even though I thought 2023 was supposed to be the year of AI. But for us, it was definitely 2024.
Well, it also takes people a second to adopt things. Thinking about AI and also some bills that we covered this year, it was really interesting how both of us individually decided to cover stuff that talked about our electrical grid. And I feel like with AI becoming more and more pervasive, it's on everything. It's so interesting to see how these trending bills and trending topics are actually super influential with each other. So yes, our grid is aging. We don't have enough energy. How do renewables come into the conversation? But also with the rise of AI and how much extra energy we're expending and all of these other things, it's so interesting to see how these are coming together, and also how it kind of seems like we're all having these revelations about things at the same time.
Absolutely. And obviously driven by the rise in AI using energy for the data centers that are powering AI, using so much more power, as well as obviously EVs as well. Yes, putting a lot of strain on our sort of creaking, aging electricity grid. Well, let's get into it then. As we said, it's been a big year for legislation, and we're looking back today at the most notable legislation of 2024. So this is taken from Build Track 50 data. So we're looking at the top 20 bills that were most read by users of Build Track 50. So perhaps not a particularly scientific sample, but maybe. We certainly felt that the bills that we're looking at and that we're going to talk about now do reflect the general priorities of people this year in the United States. So think of it as your legislative year in review.
Our Build Track 50 Wrapped. It's super fascinating how much our state bills actually reflect the biggest national issues. And for some reason, that always seems surprising. But when it's the items that are talked about most on the biggest stage, it also makes sense that the legislatures are interested in this. And this year, like all other years, we've seen immigration, pay raises for government workers, education reform, and social issues continue to dominate the headlines and the state house floors this year and all the years past, it feels like. So let's jump in and talk about everything. Let's start with public sector pay raises, because this was a huge focus for multiple states this year. The number one most read bill of the year on Bill Track 50 was Oklahoma's Senate Bill 1292. And this bill aimed to give state employees a 9% pay raise, and it would be the first in the state across the board since 2019.
Yes. And 9% certainly sounds pretty generous, even in a time when inflation has been pretty high, though, of course, it is coming down now. And it certainly caught a lot of attention and was read by many, many thousands of people on Bill Track 50. So it will already be familiar to anybody who's subscribed to our Bill Track 50 newsletter, because every month I do a quick summary of our top bill of the month. And this bill was the top bill of the month for most months throughout the year. So it wasn't just a burst of people reading it in 1 month and then moving on. Every month there were lots and lots of people reading this bill, even though it didn't succeed. And in fact, didn't even make it out of committee. So it died very, very quickly. But people were still interested in it.
Yes. And unfortunately, Oklahoma public employees will have to keep waiting. But I wouldn't be surprised to see one or something like this one back in 2025. And then there was the North Carolina Make State Employment Great Again Act, which had a catchy name and aimed to provide immediate bonuses as well as longer-term raises for their public employees.
Catchy name, but the same outcome, unfortunately. It failed to move forward at all. So what's really interesting here is there's a clear public interest in public sector compensation. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, that the people reading the bills actually support the pay rises. They may be opposed to them. But state lawmakers certainly were opposed, as none of these bills were successful. And it's a bit of a trend over the year. But it does highlight the number one concern of voters this year, which was the cost of living and the fact that wages aren't keeping up. And of course, we saw that very clearly in the general election, and as it was one of the main driving factors that gave us the result that we got.
Yes, very interesting. And next up, something that is also on everybody's mind, immigration policy, which again was another one of the most polarizing and debated topics this year. Georgia made headlines with its Criminal Alien Track and Report Act, which successfully passed into law in May.
Yes, so this bill requires law enforcement to determine the immigration status of anyone they detain. So it's really about enhancing cooperation between local police and federal immigration authorities to detain and remove anyone who they class as illegal. And it passed largely along party party lines. Republicans for, Democrats, unsurprisingly, were opposed.
Yes. And then Minnesota had something kind of on the opposite side where Democrats tried to pass SF 2724 to make the state a sanctuary state. And this would limit the cooperation with national immigration enforcement and establish pro-immigration policies within the state. And despite a pretty intense political battle, it didn't pass.
No, it didn't. And the failure of Minnesota's bill really shows how contentious immigration remains. So opponents were arguing that the legislation would worsen what they see as a border crisis by opening the state up to a large influx of new migrants and preventing authorities from catching and prosecuting criminal aliens. While supporters, of course, pushed back on these claims and made the case for the needs of the labour market and generally just sort of a fair and humane treatment of people.
So on immigration, Republican-led states like Georgia pushed for more restrictive policies, while Democrats had more efforts like Minnesota's with the sanctuary bill, and those ones stalled. So we are seeing a little bit more of a trend of these restrictive policies going forward.
Absolutely.
So speaking of social issues, they were, surprise, surprise, another huge focus this year, particularly when it came to gender and education legislation. One of the most talked about bills this year was Ohio's SAFE Act.
Yes, the SAFE Act tackled two major issues. First of all, it restricted gender-affirming care for minors, and then it also regulated school sports participation with the attempt to stop trans women competing in women's sports. And what made this bill really stand out was its dramatic path to becoming law.
Yeah, it passed through the Republican-led legislature and then was vetoed by the Republican governor, Mike DeWine, and then lawmakers overrode the veto to make the bill a law. And I feel like this bill was, and bills like this were particularly talked about this year because we had the Olympics and sports were on so many people's minds. Absolutely. And what is fair and what isn't fair. And there was, these testing things for runners and gymnasts. And I mean, there was the boxer. It was just, was a super pervasive topic. It showed in the legislature too. And DeWine said when he vetoed, "I continue to believe that it is in the best interests of the children for these medical decisions to be made by the child's parents and not by the government."
Yes, absolutely. But the legislature overruled him, which shows just how strongly other Republicans felt about this issue, that they're actually willing to overrule their own Republican governor.
Yes, and education reform also saw plenty of action. Georgia passed its Early Literacy Act, which aims to improve elementary school reading skills, and that one got nearly unanimous support.
Yes, it's hard to argue with helping kids to read. Obviously, the most important thing that schools have to do. But other education bills were far more controversial. So Georgia's Promise Scholarship Act, for example, allows public funds to be used for private school education in a voucher-style system, which passed and did become law despite being opposed by every single Democratic legislator. I mean, we've seen how hugely controversial these sorts of voucher schemes are, and I wrote several times this year about the marathon efforts that the Texas legislature made to try and pass such a similar scheme, which failed over and over again, basically because of opposition from Republican legislators.
Yeah, and I mean, even school choice was on Colorado ballots this year. So school choice and vouchers and all of this access is something that I think we're going to see even more and more of next year and
Absolutely.
For years to follow. Then there was another bill for New Hampshire, which was HB 1473. And that one tried to ban social emotional learning in schools. And that one didn't even get a floor vote.
No, I think the social emotional learning ban was a step too far, particularly in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. Education remains then a major battleground, and these highly partisan debates play out at the state level and at all levels, really. So we've spoken quite a bit about book bans, which was another big trend over recent years, big trend in 2024. So schools really have become the front line of partisan politics, with these struggles affecting every aspect, from the school board to the classroom, all the way through to the legislator.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy to see how it's kind of exploded the last few years. And then we have another big category like criminal justice reform bills, which is something that, again, is kind of there year after year. We're still trying to figure it out. And they didn't always make progress, but some bills made waves. So Illinois' HB 5219, for example, would have eliminated the mandatory minimum sentences in the state and allowed inmates to earn credit for early release.
Yes, and this bill did get a lot of attention. It was the second most read bill of the year. But despite these ambitious goals, it died in committee.
That is a very reoccurring theme with big criminal justice reform proposals. Lots of buzz, little action on the floor.
Absolutely. I mean, it's really hard to get any kind of sensible reform enacted in this area. Lawmakers basically look like they're being soft on crime and criminals, which is never a good political look, particularly in an election year. Even though it's quite clear that putting more and more people in prison for longer isn't the right way to go.
Talking about good looks, military bills, veterans bills, those are also things that we see a lot. And military and veteran benefits fared better in many states. Not quite a surprise, but not always. So if you take California's AB 46, for instance, this bill aimed to exempt military pensions from state taxes.
Absolutely. So interestingly, only California and Washington, D.C. actually fully tax military pensions, the only places in the U.S. that do that. And AB 46 had strong support in the Assembly to actually remove those taxes, but it stalled out in the Senate. And that was interesting because it's, in a lot of ways, it's the opposite of criminal justice reform. No lawmaker actually wants to be seen anti-vet. So veteran bills usually do very well.
And considering how much attention this issue got, I wouldn't be surprised to see it come back next session. And then we had property rights legislation that we saw really mixed success with across the country this year. So Georgia passed its Squatter Reform Act unanimously, which supporters say strikes a good balance between property rights and due process.
Yes, this is another one of those areas that I've written about during the year. And it's interesting that Georgia had so much success with this bill while other property-related measures in other states didn't move as easily. So I wrote about the wave of anti-squatter legislation, particularly driven by the events in New York and the action that New York was actually taking. So there have been a number of bills introduced trying to do the same thing, which is effectively making it easier to evict unwanted people from your property, but foul of due process laws and regulations as well. It's actually quite difficult to evict somebody unless you can prove that they shouldn't be there, which obviously takes time and is quite lengthy.
Yeah, and this is something that is a newer trend. I haven't seen this before throughout the years. So times are changing, but they're still kind of staying the same. So I guess looking big picture, what is the big takeaway from this year and the most notable state bills of 2024?
Well, first, the bills that got the most attention tended to mirror the big national issues. So immigration, wages, education, social policy. These all dominated state legislatures across the country. Secondly, we saw more right-winging legislation pass, particularly in Republican states. Now, of course, as I said at the beginning, this isn't a particularly sort of scientific analysis of bills. It was just looking at the bills that were most popular on Bill 1250. But it was striking that it was the the more Republican bills passing where the Democratic bills tended not to. And finally, even high-profile bills like Oklahoma's pay raises and Illinois' criminal justice reforms, they often fail to get across the finish line, even with a lot of attention and people supporting them. But of course, the most important takeaway is that chickens in Hawaii are no longer safe.
Well, it is clear that state houses are where the real action is, and they often do reflect the national divides that we're feeling all over in a really immediate way. And whether it's immigration crackdowns, pay raises, or gender legislation, these bills really show us where states and their voters are heading.
Yes, absolutely. State politics may not always get the same headlines as Congress, but they're hugely consequential.
Well, and that's why we're here, breaking it down for you.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And we'll always be here. So thanks for listening to Beyond the Bill Number for our inaugural year, the first year of our podcast. And we'll be back in 2025.
And don't forget to subscribe, share, and keep the conversation going. And I guess we'll catch you next year.
Yes. Yes, you just had to go and make the bad joke.
I mean, come on, you can only make that joke once a year. See you, everyone.
Bye bye.